When we think about the fall of House Targaryen, our minds immediately jump to Aerys II, the Mad King, whose paranoia and cruelty directly sparked Robert's rebellion. We remember him screaming, "Burn them all," as wildfire caches were planted throughout King's Landing. We recall the brutal executions of Rickard and Brandon Stark that finally pushed the realm into open rebellion. But if we trace the roots of that catastrophic collapse back far enough, we find ourselves standing in the presence of one of the most beloved Targaryen kings, a man who spent his childhood as a squire to a hedge knight, sleeping in ditches and living among the small folk. We find ourselves looking at Aegon V Targaryen, known to history as Aegon the Unlikely, and to his closest friend as simply Egg. The connection between the benevolent Aegon V and his mad grandson Aerys II isn't immediately obvious. After all, these were men separated by a generation with vastly different temperaments and entirely opposite reputations. Aegon the Unlikely is remembered fondly, even lovingly, by those who study Westerosi history. His reign is often painted as a time when someone truly cared about the common people, when a king who had lived among them tried desperately to improve their lives. Meanwhile, Aerys II is universally reviled as a monster whose madness nearly destroyed everything the Targaryens had built over 3 centuries. So, how do we draw a line from one to the other? How did the reign of good King Aegon set the stage for the horrors of the Mad King? The answer lies not in malice or cruelty, but in the most tragic form of causality, where good intentions, thwarted dreams, and desperate measures combine to create consequences that echo through generations. To understand how Aegon V's reign led to Aerys II's madness, we need to examine 3 critical elements. First, the political weakening of the crown that occurred during Aegon's reign as he fought losing battles against entrenched nobility. Second, the catastrophic attempt to restore dragons at Summerhall that traumatized the Targaryen family and killed most of its key members. And third, the way these 2 factors combine to create the perfect conditions for Aerys II's eventual descent into paranoid tyranny. Let's begin with the man himself, because understanding Aegon V requires us to look at just how unlikely his path to the throne truly was. Born in 200 AC as the 4th son of Prince Maekar Targaryen, who was himself the 4th son of King Daeron II, young Aegon had about as much chance of becoming king as any minor noble's 3rd son has of inheriting a castle. The succession seemed clear, his older brother stood ahead of him, and the normal course of events suggested he would live his life as a prince of the realm, perhaps governing some castle or serving in an important position, but never wearing the crown. This distance from the throne gave him a freedom that most princes never experience. When his father Maekar, then Prince of Summerhall, agreed to let young Aegon squire for the hedge knight Sir Duncan the Tall, it was because there seemed to be no harm in it. The boy would never be king, so why not let him learn what life was truly like in the 7 kingdoms? And learn he did. For years, Aegon traveled the realm as Duncan's squire, keeping his identity hidden, his head shaved to conceal the distinctive silver, gold hair of House Targaryen. He slept in stables and under the stars. He saw how small folk lived, how they struggled, how they suffered under the capricious rule of lords who viewed them as little more than property. He witnessed the casual cruelties that characterized life for the common people, the way nobles could destroy lives on a whim, the way justice worked differently depending on whether you wore silk or homespun. These experiences shaped Aegon in ways that no amount of tutoring in the Red Keep ever could have. He developed an empathy for the small folk that was virtually unprecedented among Targaryen royalty. More than that, he developed a vision for what Westeros could be, a realm where the common people had rights and protections, where lords couldn't exercise unlimited power over their subjects, where justice might actually mean something for everyone. But fate, as it so often does in Westeros, had other plans. Aegon's elder brother Daeron died of the pox. His brother Aerion, known for his cruelty and madness, drank wildfire believing it would transform him into a dragon, dying in agony. Their father Maekar died in battle. Suddenly, impossibly, Aegon found himself 4th in line no longer. When a great council was called to determine the succession in 233 AC, the choices were limited and problematic. Aerion had left an infant son, but few wanted to risk another mad king. Daeron had left a daughter, Viella, who was described as simple-minded. The crown was offered to Aegon's older brother, the Maester Aemon Targaryen, serving at the wall, but Aemon refused, insisting that Aegon should rule, and so at 33 years old, the fourth son of a fourth son became king. He was called Aegon the Unlikely, a name that captured both the unlikeliness of his ascension and perhaps the unlikeliness that he could succeed in what he was about to attempt. From the very beginning of his reign, Aegon V made his intentions clear. He would be a reforming king. He would use his power to improve the lives of the small folk, to curtail the excessive privileges of the nobility, to create a more just society. It was an admirable goal, even a noble one. The problem was that Aegon fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power in Westeros. Or perhaps he simply hoped that the power of the crown would be sufficient to overcome the entrenched interests arrayed against him. We don't know the specific details of all of Aegon's reforms. The historical record is frustratingly vague on the particulars, but we know their general nature. He enacted laws protecting the rights of the small folk. He granted them protections they had never known before. He attempted to limit the arbitrary power of lords over their subjects. He sent massive shipments of food to the north during the brutal winter that lasted from 230 AC to 236 AC, aid that many lords thought excessive. The reaction from the nobility was predictable and fierce. These lords had held power over their subjects for generations, even centuries. They viewed their rights and privileges as fundamental to the social order. To them, Aegon's reforms weren't enlightened governance, they were an assault on the very foundations of Westerosi society. The Great Council that had elevated Aegon to the throne had included many lords who already viewed him with suspicion. They called him half a peasant, a reference to his years living among the small folk. They had reluctantly accepted him as king, but they had never truly embraced him. Now he was proving their worst fears correct, using his power to elevate the commons at their expense. The opposition manifested in multiple ways. Some lords engaged in open defiance, refusing to implement Aegon's reforms in their lands. Others staged rebellions and uprisings that forced Aegon to spend much of his reign in armor, leading armies to quell dissent. The historical record tells us that Aegon V was forced to deal with numerous rebellions throughout his 26-year reign. He put down the Fourth Blackfire Rebellion in 236 AC, with Sir Duncan the Tall personally slaying Daemon III Blackfire in single combat. He had to intervene in the Westerlands on 3 separate occasions because of the incompetent leadership of Lord Tytos Lannister. The realm was in a constant state of low-level conflict as Aegon tried to force change on a nobility that would not accept it. Here's where we see the first critical failure that would lead to the eventual disaster under Aerys II. Aegon lacked the tools necessary to enforce his vision. When we look at the great reforming kings of Targaryen history, Aegon IV, who unified the 7 kingdoms, or Jaehaerys I, who was forever known as the Conciliator, we see rulers who had dragons. Those massive, fire-breathing beasts weren't just symbols of power, they were actual, undeniable force that made resistance futile. When Aegon demanded submission, he had Balerion, the Black Dread, to enforce that demand. When Jaehaerys implemented his reforms, including the controversial abolition of the Lord's right to the First Night, he did so with the understanding that rebellion against him would be suicidal. The dragons made the difference between reform and wishful thinking. Aegon V had no dragons. The last dragons had died decades before his birth, during the reign of Aegon III after the Dance of the Dragons. Without them, Aegon the Unlikely was just a king. Powerful certainly, but ultimately dependent on the cooperation of his vassals to enforce his will. And those vassals were increasingly unwilling to cooperate. As the opposition mounted, Aegon found himself forced into compromise after compromise. Each retreat from his reform agenda weakened both his political position and his legacy. The laws he managed to pass were watered down or poorly enforced. His vision of a more just Westeros was slipping away with each concession to noble power. The situation was made even worse by Aegon's own children. In an effort to build political support for his reforms, Aegon had arranged strategic marriages for 4 of his 5 children, marriages that would create alliances with the great houses and theoretically give him the backing he needed. His eldest son and heir, Prince Duncan, was betrothed to the daughter of Lord Lionel Baratheon of Storm's End. His second son, Prince Jaehaerys, was betrothed to Lady Celia Tully. His youngest son, Prince Daeron, was betrothed to Lady Olenna Redwine. His daughter, Princess Jaehaerys, was betrothed to Luthor Tyrell. These marriages would have secured support from Highgarden, the Arbor, River Run, and Storm's End, the foundations of a powerful coalition. But Aegon had allowed himself to marry for love, wedding Betha Blackwood rather than making a political match. His children had inherited his romantic streak and their mother's stubbornness. In 239 AC, Prince Duncan fell in love with Jenny of Old Stones, a commoner, some said she was mad, who claimed descent from the ancient kings of the rivers and the hills. Duncan married her and renounced his claim to the throne rather than give her up. The Baratheons, furious at this insult, briefly rose in rebellion. Then Jaehaerys and Jaehaerys fell in love with each other and wed in secret, breaking their betrothals. Even Prince Daeron eventually broke his betrothal to marry someone else for love. All 3 sons chose love over political alliance, and while this might make for romantic stories, it was a political catastrophe for Aegon. The consequences were severe. The alliances Aegon had counted on evaporated. The great houses he had hoped to bind to his cause instead became enemies, or at best, reluctant, resentful subjects. Lord Lionel Baratheon's brief rebellion when Duncan broke the betrothal was just the most visible manifestation of a broader loss of support. Aegon found himself even more isolated, trying to push reforms that most of the nobility hated without the political backing he desperately needed. As Maester Yandel would later write, treason and turmoil followed these marriage decisions, ending at Summerhall in sorcery, fire, and grief. That phrase, ending at Summerhall, brings us to the second critical element in understanding how Aegon V's reign led to Aerys II's madness, the tragedy at Summerhall in 259 AC. To understand what happened there, we need to understand Aegon's state of mind in the final years of his reign. Here was a king who had ascended to the throne with a clear vision of a better Westeros. He had spent his formative years among the small folk, seeing their suffering firsthand. He had the power of the Iron Throne behind him, and yet, after more than 2 decades as king, his reforms were crumbling. The nobility opposed him at every turn. His children had destroyed the alliances he needed. His laws were being ignored or overturned in practice. The dream was dying. Aegon became increasingly desperate and obsessed. He spent the last years of his reign searching for ancient lore about dragon breeding, commissioning expeditions to places as far away as Ashai by the Shadow in hopes of finding knowledge that hadn't been preserved in Westeros. He was convinced, despite the advice of his friends and counselors, that only with dragons could he force the lords of the 7 kingdoms to accept his reforms. It wasn't just about power for power's sake. Aegon genuinely believed that if he could restore the dragons, he could finally make real the vision of a just Westeros that had sustained him throughout his troubled reign. The dragons would give him the strength to protect the small folk he loved, to enforce the laws the nobility ignored, to create the realm he had always dreamed of. In 259 AC, Aegon summoned many of those closest to him to Summerhall, his favorite castle in the Dornish Marches, ostensibly to celebrate the impending birth of his great-grandson. His grandson Aerys and granddaughter Rhaella, the children of Prince Jaehaerys, were expecting their first child. But the gathering at Summerhall had a darker, more desperate purpose. Aegon had assembled 7 dragon eggs, 7 to honor the 7 gods. He had brought pyromancers to Summerhall, experts in wildfire, that volatile green substance that burns so hot it can melt stone. He had consulted with Jenny of Old Stones' friend, a woods witch who claimed prophetic powers, and he was going to attempt to hatch the dragons no matter what it took. What exactly happened at Summerhall remains shrouded in mystery. The castle's Maester, Corso sent a letter describing the event, but a mishap caused ink to blot out much of the crucial information. We know there was sorcery involved. We know there was wildfire. We know the flames grew out of control, becoming an inferno that burned so hot it destroyed the castle. And we know the death toll was catastrophic. King Aegon V himself perished in the flames. His eldest son, Prince Duncan the Small, who had given up his claim to the throne for love, died there too. Sir Duncan the Tall, Aegon's oldest and dearest friend, the hedge knight who had shaped the young prince into the man who would be king, also died trying to save others. Maester Corso perished as well. The tragedy claimed the lives of some of the most important members of the Targaryen court. But here's what we need to understand about Summerhall's impact. It wasn't just the immediate deaths that mattered. Devastating as those were, it was what the tragedy did to the survivors, particularly to the next 2 generations of Targaryen kings. On that same day as Summerhall burned, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen was born to Aerys and Rhaella. The child entered the world amid flames and death, smoke and sorcery, surrounded by the screams of the dying and the roar of wildfire. He would grow up haunted by Summerhall, returning to the ruins alone throughout his life, sleeping under the stars in the burned-out hall, composing sad songs about twilights and tears and the death of kings. The trauma of his birth, of being born from that horror, marked Rhaegar his entire life and influenced the decisions he would make that would eventually contribute to his father's downfall. More immediately relevant to our discussion, the crown passed not to the baby Rhaegar, but to Prince Jaehaerys, Aegon's second son, who became Jaehaerys King Targaryen. And here we see how the consequences of Summerhall ripple outward to affect the Mad King. Jaehaerys II had been present at Summerhall. He had witnessed the horror firsthand. His father had just died in flames trying to hatch dragons. His older brother had burned to death. Sir Duncan, the legendary knight and Lord Commander of the King's Guard, was gone. The castle was a smoldering ruin. Jaehaerys took the throne at age 34, but he was already a broken man. Jaehaerys II ruled for only 3 years, from 259 AC to 262 AC, before dying of illness at the young age of 37. But those 3 years are crucial to understanding Aerys. By all accounts, Jaehaerys was deeply traumatized by what he had witnessed at Summerhall. He was described as sickly, looking pale and frail, suffering from numerous ailments. More significantly, he never fully recovered from the horror he had experienced. The realm during his brief reign was essentially run by the same old counselors and advisors who had served Aegon V, men who were now aging and whose court was seen as stuffy and old-fashioned. What Jaehaerys did manage to do in his short reign was stabilize the political situation. He reconciled many of the great houses that had grown unhappy during his father's reform efforts. He proved a capable king in that limited sense, restoring order and ending the Blackfire threat once and for all during the War of the Ninepenny Kings. But the cost of this stabilization was the complete abandonment of Aegon V's reform program. The laws protecting the small folk, the limitations on noble privilege, the vision of a more just Westeros, all of it was quietly set aside. Jaehaerys was too traumatized, too focused on simply maintaining order to continue his father's work. And when he died, after just 3 years, his 18-year-old son Aerys ascended to the Iron Throne as Aerys II Targaryen. This is where everything comes together. The boy who became the Mad King inherited a very specific legacy from his grandfather and father. From Aegon V, he inherited a crown that had been weakened by decades of conflict with the nobility, a monarchy that had tried and failed to reform the realm, that had compromised away its authority piece by piece. From Jaehaerys II, he inherited the trauma of Summerhall, both directly as a tale told about his birth and indirectly through his father's damaged psyche. Aerys grew up knowing that his grandfather had died trying to hatch dragons, that his uncle and the legendary Duncan the Tall had perished in flames, that he himself had been born on that cursed day. More subtly, but perhaps more importantly, Aerys inherited a political situation where the nobility had learned they could resist royal authority. They had fought Aegon V's reforms for 26 years and won. They had forced compromise after compromise. They had seen that without dragons, a Targaryen king was just a man, and men could be opposed, pressured, forced to bend. This lesson in the limits of royal power would have profound consequences once Aerys began his own descent into madness. When Aerys II took the throne in 262 AC, he actually began with great promise. He was young, energetic, and ambitious. He declared upon his coronation that he wished to be the greatest king in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. He swept away the old, stodgy advisors who had served his father and grandfather, replacing them with younger men. Most significantly, he appointed his friend Tywin Lannister as Hand of the King, a man who was brilliant, ruthless, and effective. For the first decade or so of his reign, Aerys appeared to be succeeding. Trade flourished, the realm prospered, and Tywin's administration was so capable that many whispered it was truly the Hand, not the King, who ruled. But beneath this success, seeds of madness were germinating. Aerys had always been jealous and temperamental, but these traits began to intensify as he grew older. The relationship with Tywin became increasingly strained as Aerys grew resentful of his Hand's competence and the rumors that Tywin was the true ruler. There were troubling signs. Aerys' marriage to his sister Rhaella was unhappy from the start. He had not wanted to marry her, but had been forced to by his father based on a prophecy from Jenny of Oldstone's Wood's witch. They suffered miscarriages and stillbirths, tragedies that took a toll on both of them. Then came 277 AC and the Defiance of Duskendale, the event that shattered what little stability Aerys still possessed. Lord Dennis Darklyn of Duskendale refused to pay taxes, demanding a charter and economic privileges. When Tywin as Hand refused this demand, Lord Dennis devised a plan to go over Tywin's head directly to the king. Aerys, eager to prove he could handle matters without his domineering Hand, went to Duskendale with a small escort. It was a trap. Lord Dennis seized the king and held him prisoner for 6 months, threatening to kill him if Tywin attempted to storm the castle. It took Sir Barristan Selmy's daring solo rescue to free the king. The Defiance of Duskendale broke Aerys II completely. He emerged from that dungeon a different person. Some argue the madness had always been lurking in him, but Duskendale shattered what little sanity remained. He became paranoid, refusing to allow anyone to touch him, letting his hair and fingernails grow long and wild. He would no longer allow blades near him except for the swords of his Kingsguard. His judgments became increasingly cruel and arbitrary. He developed an obsession with fire, eventually reaching the point where he could only become aroused by watching people burn. Like his grandfather before him, Aerys became obsessed with dragons and attempted repeatedly to hatch dragon eggs, ultimately turning to wildfire when those attempts failed. And here's where the legacy of Aegon V's weakened crown becomes catastrophic. If Aerys had been a strong, sane king presiding over a powerful monarchy with dragons to back his authority, his madness might have been contained, or he might have been removed from power before things spiraled completely out of control. But he was a mad king presiding over a monarchy that had spent decades proving it could be resisted. The nobles remembered Aegon V's failed reforms. They remembered that royal authority could be opposed. When Aerys began his descent into tyranny, there was no reserve of loyalty or fear of royal power to restrain rebellion. Moreover, Aerys' obsession with fire and dragons was a direct echo of his grandfather's fatal mistake at Summerhall. Where Aegon V had desperately sought dragons to enforce his reforms, Aerys sought them as both symbols of his power and objects of his mania. The lessons of Summerhall, the dangers of attempting to restore dragons through sorcery and wildfire, had seemingly been forgotten in just 2 generations. When Aerys planted wildfire throughout King's Landing and prepared to burn the city rather than let Robert Baratheon take it, he was following a path that led directly back to that day in 259 AC when his grandfather died in flames trying to hatch dragon eggs. The final piece of this tragic puzzle is how Aegon V's well-intentioned mistakes removed the safeguards that might have prevented or limited the damage from Aerys' madness. When Duncan the Small married for love and gave up his claim to the throne, when Jaehaerys and Jaehaerys married each other, they destroyed the network of alliances that might have bound the great houses more firmly to the crown. The Baratheons, who might have been staunch royal allies through Duncan's marriage to Lionel Baratheon's daughter, instead harbored resentment that made them more willing to rebel when Robert, grandson of Rhael Targaryen, raised his banners. The other great houses similarly lacked the strong ties to the throne that Aegon had originally planned. Furthermore, when Jaehaerys II, traumatized by Summerhall and desperate to maintain stability, abandoned his father's reforms and reconciled with the nobility, he did so by essentially validating their resistance to Aegon. The message was clear: defy the king's reforms long enough and they will be withdrawn. This precedent made it much easier for the realm to unite against Aerys when his mad tyranny became unbearable. The nobles had learned they could win against a Targaryen king, and that lesson made Robert's rebellion possible. We should also consider the tragic irony in all of this. Aegon V genuinely wanted to help people. His reforms were born from real compassion and a genuine desire to create a more just society. He wasn't a tyrant seeking power for its own sake. He was a man who had seen suffering and wanted to end it. But in his desperation to enforce his vision, he destroyed himself and set in motion events that would ultimately lead to far greater suffering than any he had witnessed. The massacre at King's Landing, the sack by the Lannister forces, the murder of Rhaegar's wife and children, the extinction of the Targaryen dynasty in Westeros. All of these horrors trace their roots back to decisions made with the best intentions. Summerhall was supposed to be the solution to Aegon's problems. The dragons would give him the power to protect the small folk, to enforce his reforms, to create the just realm he had dreamed of since his days traveling with Sir Duncan the Tall. Instead, Summerhall destroyed the Targaryen family's stability, traumatized the survivors, and created the conditions for Aerys II's eventual madness. The attempted solution became the source of even greater problems, a cycle of tragedy that would ultimately bring down the dynasty that had ruled for 300 years. So when we ask how Aegon V's reign led to the Mad King Aerys II, we're really asking how good intentions, thwarted dreams, and desperate measures combined to create catastrophe. Aegon weakened the crown by fighting unsuccessful battles against the nobility. He destroyed crucial political alliances when his children married for love. He died trying to restore dragons in a magical catastrophe that traumatized his entire family. His son Jaehaerys II inherited that trauma and abandoned the reform agenda entirely, teaching the nobility that royal authority could be successfully resisted. And his grandson, Aerys II, inherited both a weakened throne and the psychological scars of being born amid fire and death at Summerhall. None of this was inevitable, and that's perhaps the cruelest part of this story. At multiple points, different decisions might have changed the outcome. If Aegon had been more pragmatic about reform, building support more slowly and carefully like Jaehaerys I had done, his changes might have lasted. If his children had honored their betrothals and built the alliances he needed, he might have had the political strength to enforce his vision without needing dragons. If he had accepted that the age of dragons was over and worked within those limitations, Summerhall would never have happened. If Jaehaerys II had ruled longer and recovered from his trauma, he might have provided stability. If Aerys II had inherited a stronger crown and avoided Duskendale, he might never have descended into complete madness. But that's not how history worked out in Westeros. Instead, we got a chain of events where each link, each decision and consequence led inexorably to the next. Aegon the Unlikely king who loved the small folk and tried to make their lives better, set in motion events that would eventually lead to his grandson becoming the Mad King, whose reign of terror ended in the sack of King's Landing and the near extinction of House Targaryen. It's a tragedy in the truest sense, where the protagonist's own actions and choices, no matter how well intentioned, lead to his downfall and the destruction of everything he held dear. This is why Aegon V's reign is so important to understanding the Mad King. Aerys II didn't arise in a vacuum. His madness wasn't just a random occurrence or simply the result of centuries of incestuous marriages. It was the culmination of specific historical forces set in motion by his grandfather's reign. The weakened crown, the trauma of Summerhall, the lesson that royal authority could be resisted, the dangerous obsession with dragons, all of these elements combine to create the perfect conditions for catastrophe. When Jaime Lannister, the young Kingsguard knight, drove his sword through Aerys' back and ended the Mad King's reign. He wasn't just killing a mad tyrant, he was ending a tragic story that had begun nearly 3 decades earlier with an unlikely king who had the best of intentions but lacked the wisdom or power to see them through. The Mad King was, in a very real sense, Aegon the Unlikely's most tragic legacy, the nightmare that grew from the ruins of a beautiful dream. And understanding this connection helps us see the full tragedy of House Targaryen's fall, how a dynasty that had ruled for 300 years could collapse so completely in just a single generation, all because one meaning king, tried to change the world and instead change the course of history in ways he never could have imagined.